because I've been trained to put a real emotional thing on these living creatures. And it's taken a lot of work to unpack that to where I don't see these so-called invasives, these introduced species, as a scourge. They're just doing their thing. People say they're just living by their original instructions, like we are as well. We're living our life. And so it's a lot more healthy, at least for my own system, to see them as organisms, as things doing their thing.
Hey there, welcome back to Treehugger. I am podcasting from Tacoma, Washington, aka Grid City, in the native land of the Puyallup tribe. This is Treehugger Podcast, the show where we reimagine ecological restoration and the episode where we discuss all the things ivy. Warning or invitation to the restorationists out there. We are going to be talking about the positive benefits and services provided by invasive species on this episode. The forthcoming soliloquy and conversation may bring up some strong feelings. My hope is you can stick with it or suspend your disbelief. I brought in some backup as always. My guest on the show is Toby Query, one of my restoration heroes. I've known him for a few decades since my time in Portland, Oregon. He's been part of the City of Portland's revegetation program since 1999. I actually learned a lot about eradicating ivy from him. And more recently, I've been hearing about his experiences at Showcake Wetlands, that is a co-designed and stewarded site with Portland's indigenous communities. Toby also founded the discussion group Portland Ecologists Unite, which created spaces to learn, discuss, and connect over current ecological issues. He is also a regular contributor to the Nature of Cities website and has given talks and led workshops at conferences, churches, schools, and natural areas locally and internationally. Toby describes his relationship with ivy as complex. In this conversation, we discuss a range of feelings about English ivy and discuss the challenges of managing it in ecological restoration efforts. We describe ivy's growth patterns, methods of dispersal, and its ability to grow abundantly in various landscapes, including urban areas. The conversation touches on different methods used to remove ivy, including mechanical removal, herbicide spraying, and cutting vines. We also talk about concerns about the use of herbicides, particularly glyphosate, due to health and environmental risks. Here we go. All the things you probably didn't want to know about ivy. Hedera, Hedera, genera numbering between 12 and 15 species, are native to a wide geographic range spanning from Western to Central Europe, Southern Europe, Micronesia, Northwestern Africa, and across Central Southern Asia, extending into Japan and Taiwan. Hedera, commonly known as ivy, is a diverse genus of evergreen plants belonging to the Araliaceae family. Commonly known as Aralia, is a family of flowering plants that includes a wide variety of species. These plants are typically characterized by their aromatic foliage and the presence of small flowers grouped in umbels or panicles. Some are used for their medicinal properties, while others are grown for their ornamental value in gardens and indoor settings. Some well-known members of the Araliaceae family include ginseng, the panic species. Ginseng is perhaps one of the most famous members of this family and is highly valued for its medicinal properties. The Aralia species. Schefflera plants are popular as houseplants and are recognized for their palmately compound leaves. Also, Polliaceae species. These are often grown as ornamental shrubs or small trees. And then the Ivies, which is recognized for its climbing or ground-creeping woody nature, and several species within this genus are cultivated for ornamental purposes. One of the most well-known and frequently grown ivies is English ivy, Hedera helix, favored for its ability to cover brick walls, forest floors, and sometimes find grown on trees. Over time, the Latin term Hedera has been used to refer to ivy plants in botanical and scientific contexts, and it remains the genus name for ivy in the botanical classification system. Hedera is believed to be derived from an earlier Indo-European root, possibly related to the Sanskrit word sveda, which means sweat or perspiration. This connection may be due to ivy's use in traditional medicine, where it was believed to induce sweating and was used for various medicinal purposes. The word ivy has an etymology rooted in Old English. It is traced back to the Old English word ithig, which referred to the ivy plant. This term ithig is believed to have Indo-European origins, with connections to words in other Germanic languages. Historically, ivy has held significant cultural and symbolic meanings. It was believed to ward off evil spirits and prevent intoxication in ancient Rome. Ivy has been associated with love, fidelity, friendship, endurance, and the eternal life of the soul in medieval Christian symbolism. I will say heavy inspiration for this episode and many hours of rumination about this topic comes from a late 2022 Dov Sachs article titled Valuing the Contributions of Non-Native Species to People and Nature. I added a link to this article in the show notes, so check it out. The paper was fascinating and discussed a shift in perspective regarding non-native species. Traditionally, research is focused on their negative impacts, but this Dov Sachs paper and this podcast suggests considering their positive consequences. The authors present a framework to assess these positive outcomes, including benefits to social cohesion, cultural identity, mental health, food and fuel production, clean water regulation, and climate change mitigation. They argue that past biases against non-native species have hindered scientific progress and policy development, emphasizing the importance of studying both the costs and benefits of these species in future research. That lopsided data colors both scientists and the public's thinking on invasive species. So I've been wondering how much I really know about invasive species, so I wanted to start with ivy, one of the most ubiquitous species found in the natural areas around me. And given the difficult decisions we make in restoration, I have been wondering if the benefits might offset or mitigate negative impacts if we knew more or even help change our language and framing of invasive species. So if you remember Brandon Drucker, who's a thought partner and friend of the podcast, last spring, we traveled to Victoria, British Columbia to an ivy basket making class at the Compost Center. The workshop was led by Ria, a local restorationist and wildcrafter. At that time, we were exploring other things to do with ivy besides rip it out of the ground and pile it or haul it away to be trashed or composted. The whole trip got me thinking about ivy's ecosystem goods and services and home it provides. For months, Google Scholar has been sending me semi-weekly hits about literature being published right now, some of which I've included in the show notes. I hope this appeals to some of your logical, sciencey brains. So ivies encompass a range of species, each characterized by differences in leaf shape, size, flower color, and fruit characteristics. While native to Eurasia and North Africa, ivies have been introduced to North America and Australia and beyond. On level ground, ivy maintains a creeping growth habit, typically staying within a range of 5 to 20 centimeters. However, when it encounters suitable surfaces for climbing, such as trees, rock outcrops, or human-made structures like quarry rock, faces, and masonry, it can ascend to impressive heights, sometimes exceeding 30 meters above the ground. Ivy exhibits two distinct types of leaves: palmately lobed juvenile leaves on creeping and climbing stems, and unlobed cordate adult leaves on fertile flowering stems. The juvenile shoots are slender and flexible, often utilizing small aerial roots to cling to the surfaces like rocks or tree bark, while the adult shoots are thicker and self-supporting. This growth habit and ivy's other traits provide habitat and shelter. So growing as a vine, covering trees, rocks, and structures, this dense growth provides shelter and habitat for various wildlife, including birds, insects, and small mammals. It can offer protection from predators and harsher weather conditions. Ivy plays a crucial role in sheltering and overwintering a variety of invertebrates within its dense tangle of woody growth. Birds and small mammals also use ivy as nesting sites, contributing to increased complexity within woodland environments. It attracts pollinators. Ivy flowers produce nectar, making them a valuable late-season food source for pollinators such as bees and butterflies. This can help support pollinator populations, including those that are essential for the reproduction of other plants. There's even an ivy bee, and there's an article in the show notes about how it is attracted by visual and olfactory cues of inconspicuous Hedera helix flowers. The plant produces small greenish-yellow flowers in umbels. It's worth noting that while bees are the main pollinators of ivy, other insects such as wasps and hoverflies may also visit ivy flowers and contribute to pollination. The diversity of pollinators that ivy attracts can vary depending on the local ecosystem and the availability of other flowering plants. Following the flowering phase, ivy bears small berries, typically greenish-black, dark purple, or rarely yellow in color, with diameters ranging from 5 to 10 millimeters. These berries ripen from late winter to mid-spring and serve as a vital food source for birds, which in turn aid in the dispersal of ivy seeds. So as a food source, these ivy berries, while mildly toxic to humans, are a source of food for many bird species, including blackbirds and thrushes. These berries provide sustenance during the fall and winter months when other food sources may be scarce. Moving on, as an erosion control, ivy's extensive root system helps stabilize soil and prevent erosion, particularly on slopes and embankments. Its ability to cling to surfaces and protect against soil erosion is ecologically significant in preventing land degradation. The ivy contributes to carbon sequestration by absorbing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere during photosynthesis. While ivy alone may not have a major impact, collectively, plants like ivy play a role in mitigating climate change. There's even a paper in the show notes about ivy-derived biochar's potential as a substrate amendment. So wait, there's more! English ivy offers more explicit human benefits. Air purification. Like many plants, ivy helps improve air quality by absorbing pollutants and releasing oxygen during photosynthesis. Aesthetic appeal. Maybe not for everyone, but ivy is a popular ornamental plant in gardens and landscapes, adding a touch of greenery and a lush backdrop to outdoor spaces. In the world of literature and art, ivy-covered ruins were a staple of the Romantic movement in landscape painting, symbolizing the ephemerality of human endeavors and the sublime power of nature. The image of ivy-covered historic buildings also led to the term Ivy League for prestigious American universities. In horticulture, ivies are highly sought after within their native regions and suitable climates elsewhere. They are valued for their evergreen foliage, their versatility and design, often used in narrow planting spaces or to enhance the aesthetic appeal of tall or wide walls, while also concealing unsightly structures like fences or tree stumps. Numerous ivy cultivars have been developed, boasting variegated foliage and unique leaf shapes for ornamental purposes. Thermal regulation is huge. The dense foliage of English ivy can provide insulation for buildings, helping to moderate temperatures and reduce energy consumption for heating and cooling. There's a link in the show notes to a study looking at vertical greenery systems coupled to a building. Specifically, the study finds that Hedera helix performs best when the foliage layer is at an intermediate stage of growth, reducing internal and external surface temperatures significantly. The green facade also attenuates incoming heat flux and flattens the daily temperature profile. So part and parcel to that is shade, which can also offer some privacy. It can be used to create natural privacy screens, providing shade and enhancing the comfort of outdoor areas. And then, importantly, stress reduction. We all know that gardening and being in proximity to green spaces, including green or ivy-colored areas, can reduce stress and improve overall mental well-being. Incidentally, this past week, David Williams, a Seattle author, blogged about Seattle's graffiti problem by promoting the growth of ivy along freeway walls. Ivy's rapid, low-maintenance growth can deter graffiti. Additionally, ivy-covered walls could have several benefits, including a calming green appearance, he says, microclimate regulation, and reduction of air pollution, all things I kind of just said. Williams proposes a similar approach using Himalayan blackberry for noise reduction and heavy metal absorption, making it an ideal solution for freeway walls. Ultimately, they advocate for embracing the rampant growth of these plants to beautify and enhance freeway spaces. And then we come to medicinal uses. Historically, English ivy has been used in traditional medicine for various ailments, although its medicinal properties should be approached with caution and under some guidance. Just to let you all know, along with the basket-making trip last spring, I have also been investigating other ways of knowing and using plants in the forest. I just started herb school as an apprentice at Hawthorne and Honey. My Saturdays recently have been spent with my instructor, Sarah Butters, and about a dozen other herbalists. Sarah emphasizes intuitive herbalism, gravitating towards plants that speak to us and what we need for our unique minds and bodies. Sometimes, she says, the plants may appear in abundance when we need them most. So I'll report back on how to use ivy and herbal remedies probably later, but it's important to note that its benefits and potential risks should be considered cautiously. Always consult a professional or herbalist before using English ivy or any herbal remedy for medicinal purposes. Nevertheless, in folk medicine, common ivy is used both internally and externally for various conditions, including bronchitis, gastritis, and skin issues. When it comes to respiratory health, ivy has been used to alleviate symptoms of respiratory conditions like bronchitis and asthma. It helps by loosening mucus and easing coughs. The plant contains compounds with anti-inflammatory properties as well, which might be beneficial for conditions involving inflammation. Ivy has also been used topically for skin conditions like psoriasis and eczema because it helps reduce itching and inflammation. It contains antioxidants that help combat free radicals, and ivy has been used traditionally for wound healing. So Google Scholar fed me this fascinating article on an analysis of the phytodrugs market based on common ivy. As you might generalize, the pharmaceutical market is continually expanding, driven by both disease prevalence and commercial interests. Respiratory tract diseases are one area where the assortment of medications is growing, particularly with generic options. Herbal remedies, including common ivy, have gained popularity due to their safety and effectiveness. And I would say I haven't seen these on my shelves in the drugstore, like I see elderberry, but potentially in the UK and in Europe, you see more herbal remedies associated with common ivy. So people often use herbal remedies because of their low toxicity and good tolerance. And as we just talked about, ivy with its diverse chemical composition is particularly promising for treating respiratory conditions. It has expectorant and mucolytic effects and can improve bronchial drainage. Ivy leaf extract also has anti-inflammatory, bactericidal, and antifungal properties. So these medicines are effective, safe, and sometimes surpass synthetic drugs due to their complex action. So in conclusion, common ivy seems to be a valuable medicinal plant with a wide range of biologically active substances and pharmacological actions, making it effective for treating respiratory conditions. Even though I don't want to pump up the pharmaceutical market, this suggests that there's potential, but it does offer some potential for the development of high-quality, easy-to-access ivy-based drug. I do want to temper this saying it's crucial to exercise caution when using English ivy for health purposes. It can be toxic if ingested, so internal use should be avoided without proper guidance. Some people have allergic reactions on their skin when they touch it as well, and its safety during pregnancy and for children is uncertain. I don't want to give it a carte blanche thumbs up. So this whole thing about herbal remedies kind of hits home for me too in regards to respiratory conditions, because if you've listened to the podcast a lot, you know my mom died last year. She suffered from respiratory illnesses her whole life. She actually lived decades longer than her doctors expected, and she leaned on her medical doctors and pharmaceuticals in order to survive. I'd feel a little guilty not encouraging more herbal remedies because in the latter years of her life, she had a bad cough, like worse than I had ever heard it. Not that it would have changed her mind, but I just wonder, especially for other folks who have themselves respiratory conditions or friends or family that are suffering from those sort of things, it might be worth exploring ivy extracts for some relief. So from an ancestral standpoint, my family generally came from the native range of ivy. Who knows if they ever used ivy extract to cure what was ailing them? But this is not information that was passed down through the generations. Some previous conversation on Treehugger podcast, we've talked to Jessica Hernandez, and something she noted was that invasive species are displaced relatives, right? For whatever reason that we escaped the native range of ivy, it has been brought here to North America, and it is fairly ubiquitous and abundant. I have lost that connection to the plant. From another indigenous perspective, Nicholas Rio and Laura Ogden wrote about how plants have a purpose in relationship with humans. And so this is one that it's like staring us in the face. And so it might help to have some reckoning about why it is so present. And if it's just a symptom of how we've treated the land, but it's actually serving a purpose. And I hesitate to use the word function, but again, using that tradition that Nick Rio talked about is that plants exist in relationship with humans and that they may have a role. So let's think about that. Woo, that was a lot. Thanks for sticking with it. Enough of the book report. Next up is my conversation with Toby. The conversation covers a lot of ground regarding the benefits and challenges of ivy, particularly in the context of environmental change and ecological impacts. Importantly, we explore the idea of coexisting with ivy rather than eradicating it completely, considering its roles in supporting wildlife, providing habitat, and contributing to the mycorrhizal network in the soil. Toby and I even challenged some deeply held myths regarding ivy's potential to harm trees when it becomes too heavy, but the discussion emphasizes the need for a context-dependent approach, taking into account specific environments and community priorities. There's also mention of the importance of studying the effects of ivy removal on soil moisture and the mycelial network, which remains a significant question for future ecological research. So, ultimately, through my research, I'm finding that ivy is a diverse and ecologically important genus of evergreen plants with a wide geographic distribution. Its significance ranges from providing crucial nectar and fruit sources for wildlife to cultural and symbolic associations throughout history. Whether admired for its ornamental beauty or studied for its ecological impact, ivy continues to be a fascinating and multifaceted plant. Thanks for sticking through that deep dive. Enjoy the continued conversation with one of my favorite ecologists.
Great. My name is Toby Query. I'm a father, a partner, and an ecologist. I have worked for the City of Portland's Watershed Revegetation Program for over 20 years, and I steward natural areas for all Portlanders. And our program works in the urban environment. And I'm also a certified ecologist from the Ecological Society of America, not the Society of Ecological Restoration like you are, Michael. And I also started a group that's no longer, but for about 7 or 8 years, called Portland Ecologists Unite, where we would discuss ecological topics every month in the Portland area with practitioners. So that's me. I'm also a white male, middle-aged. So that's important parts too.
Good. Thank you for your positionality. Some people, since we're on audio, some people may not have realized. What comes to mind when I ask you to think about ivy? I feel like it's fairly ubiquitous. It exists in a bunch of ecosystems all over the world. But for some people who are unfamiliar with it, so you could just describe what comes to your mind.
Well, what comes to my mind is it's an evergreen vine that grows up trees. So I often see it growing up trees. I often see it along roadsides in forest gaps, and it can be quite abundant. It can grow up to the tops of trees, and it's thought to kill the trees, but it's actually not a parasitic plant. It doesn't root into the barks of trees. It just holds on, and it can have a lot of those hairs that hold on to the bark. So it can be quite hard to pull off. I definitely smell the ivy. Having pulled a lot of ivy, I know you have the smell of ivy. I don't know how would you describe it? Definitely
there's like a funk.
There's a little funk. Soil. Yeah. It's a little
earthy,
chemical. Yeah.
Earthy and chemically. Yeah, for sure. It's very distinct, I think, once you know it. Yeah, it is hard to explain.
And on the ground, it can be quite abundant. It weaves with itself, and it can be where it's quite abundant. It can be almost foot tall with like multiple layers of ivy leaves.
So when you say abundant, is like volume wise, like I walk through it like up to like my knees in the most extreme examples. Seems like it continues to layer upon itself. How do you see it like establishing and dispersing in the landscape?
A couple ways, but the fastest across the landscape is through seeds. Birds like robins and starlings, they'll eat the seeds, and the seeds are quite large and lightweight, and they germinate really quick. I collected some seeds one time just to see what they do, to really see what would happen. So I planted them in some soil, and they almost immediately germinated. pretty interesting. So they can be spread miles by birds. And then also the vines themselves, as they creep along, they'll root. But oftentimes birds will be sitting in trees, poop out a seed, and then that seed will be at the base of that tree that they like to grow up. And the ivy needs to be in full sun to flower and fruit. So if it's in the shade of a tree, it won't fruit unless it's at the very top of a tree, or you'll see it on sides of roads in the opening. People plant it.
Yeah, that's right. Do you see it for sale still, like in nurseries?
I see it in like cute circle or heart shapes in pots where you like give the loved one to put in your house.
Those are adorable. Some people might say that's where it belongs. If anything, if you're going to grow it, is it just like contained like in a cage in your house? What are some methods you've used to remove or eradicate ivy from the forest?
The methods we used to remove ivy include herbicide spraying, a combination of cutting vines and spraying the cut stems, also just cutting the vines off the trees. We've also worked on pulling ivy back from trees. Some people call it the tree saver method. We've also cut it on the ground and like rolled it up in like a blanket or sleeping bag. I think that's it. Cutting off trees with machetes and chainsaws. We've tried chainsaws, but they can damage the tree sometimes. So we just use machetes or hand saws.
Yeah, and some people, I don't know if a lot of folks know that you can spray it. I always thought for a long period of time, I thought like the cuticle on the leaves prevented that. But I came to realize a while ago after seeing you speak about it that we could spray it. And it totally, it increased the rate at which we could move across the landscape, removing it from the landscape, I would say, for a while anyway. Even though a lot of people want it gone, herbicide is like a pretty firm boundary for a lot of folks too. That's just a line they don't want to cross, like a method they don't like to use.
Yep. And I can really see both sides. I have been completely against herbicide and I've been completely for herbicide. And now I'm not totally against it, but mostly. So I think it's important when using herbicide is to think about, are you just like chemical mowing? Like, are you planning on you have to spray every year, 5 years, 10 years, and there's no end in spraying, or that it's a very like targeted single treatment or a couple treatments, because the chemicals are toxic, and the chemicals that we found that work is a mix of a couple herbicides. And there's research on the toxicity of each herbicide, but there isn't research on the health effects of the combination of the herbicides. And so soon after I did a lot of research on how you kill ivy with herbicide, there was also a lot of information coming out about glyphosate. And you might be aware of the man who won a couple $100 million from Monsanto, now Bayer, because he was exposed to glyphosate and got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So I'm also more aware that the exposure to who's applying the herbicide needs to be incorporated into how we are managing land. So I reduce it quite a bit. Where are you on the herbicide?
On herbicides?
Yeah.
Honestly, I take responsibility for increasing the amount of herbicides that we've been using in our program. I'd say when I first took on directing the professional crews, it was pretty much like only mechanical and manual removal, like clearing and grubbing almost everything except for a very select number of species that we knew or know we can't get rid of without herbicide, like knotweed or just things like that. And subsequently, too, within the last few years, City of Seattle has effectively, it's not a ban, but effectively has banned it or re-tiered glyphosate. So we no longer use glyphosate. A lot of people at the beginning, there's a lot of hemming and hawing or a lot of whining that we lost a tool in our toolbox. But honestly, having some of my own health struggles and listening to a lot of podcasts, there's such the onus of burden is on glyphosate as like the number one chemical or herbicide researched about, and the health impacts of it, I think, are pretty incredibly disastrous, honestly. I think so. I'm super proud. I don't need to deal with it anymore. So I just think it's like the way it was, it was initially created as a antibacterial, essentially. It just, from what I know, it crosses the blood-brain barrier and allows other nasty things to get into your brain, and it just kills us slowly.
Right. Yeah.
And for a long time, I think I made a distinction between, using it in the natural areas is different than using it on food. Or Cheerios are potentially laced with it and things like that. And I thought that was a big difference. But honestly, yeah, when you think of the worker safety and just the incidental exposures to it and the cumulative effects, like you said, the synergistic effects between different chemicals, even the additives like the surfactants that are proprietary that we don't even know that are in the chemicals, it's just potentially just bad news. So for at least glyphosate anyway, I'm like firmly anti-glyphosate. So
yeah, and with ivy, we were finding that we were initially doing a lot of damage to sword ferns and some other shrubs like osoberry and other ones.
mm-hmm.
And so we realized we needed the applicators to have another tool to move the sword ferns away from where they were applying it. And also I did some applications where we just sprayed once and then we would come back and just hand pull the rest of it. And then for me, anytime applying any kind of herbicide or doing any kind of restoration, if you're any kind of weed treatment, is to follow up with a plan on what's next. And so not only was I looking at the effects of the herbicide on the ivy, but I was also looking at what the effects on the ferns and what's coming back after we spray. And then also the next step, seeding and looking at trying to restore certain native seeds. And so we have a robust survey we've done with a couple other agencies, namely Metro and Clean Water Services. And I think you've seen some of our plots in Portland where we seeded, and some are quite successful and some are not. Like we still don't know the best thing to do, or we don't have like the stamp of like, do this everywhere. Every place I think is context dependent as far as like how effective things are.
And I'm worried about that too. And I think we've talked about this. So ivy is shade tolerant, right? So you do find in these very, very shady forests. And so light is like a limiting factor in getting other things to grow, right? It's just like you're left with bare ground, I guess, which we don't like.
Yeah. And in a forest environment, basically with removing ivy, you're creating quite a big disturbance without like a forest fire would kill a lot of the canopy. And so you'd have, a lot of light. And a lot of the understory native species take a long time to grow. Like we were finding some wouldn't even germinate for like 3 or 4 years. And so we're trying to establish basically an old growth understory, if that's a thing, as fast as we can, and so like, I think that's part of what I struggle with just restoration and doing herbicide application is you quickly change the tone and the structure of part of the ecosystem, but the change has happened. It's been basically the process of colonization that created the ivy to do well in these areas. It's not just the ivy just showed up one day and is like, I like it and I'm a horrible plant and I'm going to kill the trees. It's like, oh, hey, these other disturbances happen. You planted me, either the birds planted me or people planted me. There's other disturbances like pollution, there's earthworms, there's slugs, and there's also the absence of maybe elk and deer that do eat ivy. And so you have these confluence of factors that have created a lot of ivy, but getting rid of the ivy doesn't change the factors that made the ivy do well in the first place. And so just removing ivy on the surface, it can look like you've restored the ecosystem, but the conditions are still there that the ivy still likes. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's my struggle of restoration is that, it's easy to blame the ivy on the ecosystem, but it's actually It's the pollution, it's the CO2 levels, it's the nitrogen deposition, it's the noise, it's the fragmentation, the clear cutting. It's all those factors.
Right. Yeah. One of the principles we talk about is addressing like the underlying conditions that led to the degradation or removing the degradation of the source of damage that created the circumstances to begin with. So I don't know if you found it. There's lots of acquisitions that occurred. So places like become green spaces, like parks. The state or the city buys property and adds them to our inventory of lands. And it's like in the 80s and 90s, in Seattle anyway, there's lots of funds to like buy land. And then all of a sudden, where restoration got its foothold was like, well, what do we do with this stuff now? So it's really been like 30, 40 years and more. And so what I see is some of these green spaces, it's all parcelized, but there was probably maybe a home there on the edge of this very steep slope, or maybe in this like wooded ravine where there's some streams flowing through it. So it was like high conservation values. But there may have been ivy growing there for whatever reason, but it's been growing like without any stewardship, without much human interaction for like decades, right? That's the state we come upon now when we find an area where it's like knee-high ivy, every single tree is covered in it. Like what you said, what triggered that thought to me was that you said like rapidly within like months, we bring the ivy cover down, but it's taken decades essentially for it to get to that composition, to like the community to us reassemble after people left. So
yeah, and I think we do a good job as urban ecologists to identify what the problem is and what to eliminate. But it's harder to be like, how do I really take care of this place in the long term? Get to know the trees, the hydrology, the soil, and what's going on. And I think part of that stewardship oftentimes is cutting the ivy off the trees and even just to like get into the site. Sometimes you have to do that. But I've also seen where we have done mostly herbicide control and cutting off trees of ivy. And then after about 10 years, you look at it and no stewardship has occurred in the meantime. You're like, well, actually, it looks the same like it does 10 years ago. And I know in the meantime, we may have killed a trillium or two or sword fern. And so if we keep doing that cycle, was it worth it in the first place? Are those trees in a better place now? Is the forest, is the habitat, are the birds and trees happier that we did that? Or was that just a shock? But the trajectory seems to be going towards the ivy, holly, clematis mix with native trees. It's like, I think there's a middle ground where we can embrace this change that is happening and moving in a direction, or at least certain non-native species are going to be abundant and continue to be abundant. And that we're also looking at wider goals of air quality, wildlife habitat, water quality at the same time. So I don't want to make all these decisions. Like, I feel like having the community more invested in some of these decisions, namely, marginalized communities, BIPOC communities that have been excluded from natural areas currently in certain ways. And so I think there's more work for us urban ecologists to get better feedback of like, what are our goals for these areas and what does the community want? Like, what are the biggest goals for the community? Is it air quality? Is it water quality? Is it native plant composition? Is it medicinal plants? Is it food plants? How do you deal with making decisions on how to steward a piece of property? Is it mostly yourself, or do you have those been informed by diverse communities?
I would say largely no. Any plans we have probably predate any equitable planning that we may actually be doing today. A lot of vegetation management plans, they're really just focused on like habitat, like generically good for birds and salmon and eagles and things like that. And I would say too, the people that were mostly involved as stakeholders and in submitting comments or their opinion are largely in that mindset as well. People don't feel empowered or any agency to think that invasives have a place at all, I guess. So I just think that they're like invasives. Like I get emails all the time that are like, there are invasives in this area. Can you do something about them? And I'm like, well, what does that mean to you? Like in an email, I was like, what does that actually mean? I was like, which species are you concerned about? So I ask people like really to just like evoke more different language about it. And then sometimes people will send me back like a link from the noxious weed website. And they're like, this is the invasive we're talking about. I'm like, I read that website. Like I live on that website. So more and more, I think our jobs are like 10% botanical sometimes and like 90% like social or political.
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I think it's important. Most people don't know how they got the perspective of native good, not native bad, even though, of course, there's a huge history going back to colonization. There's a tie to Nazism. They love native plants. And so I know myself, I've been reading a lot. I know you have too, and you've been doing some great work on this of like, what's the history that has made us talk in this really severe warlike language and made this binary to where if plants or animals are not natives, they actually aren't alive and we can just kill them without any ethical repercussions. And invasion biology, it was really bumped up by Charles Elton. Do you know this guy?
Oh, yeah.
And
I know that guy.
his book basically mirrors, it opens with a paragraph about how these species are similar to like a nuclear bomb explosion and nuclear proliferation. And it's just clear that like what was happening then with the World War II and nuclear proliferation is that the culture, he took what was happening in the culture and applied it to ecology. You know, I was like, that's not science. That's using this political rhetoric and putting it into a science perspective. So reading that was a light to me of like, oh, actually invasive biology isn't, say it's not science, because there's a lot of people doing a lot of science around it, but the word, the terminology and the feeling of it is, it's really emotional. And for me, for many years, I would look at a tree with an ivy up it and I would get sick to my stomach. I would get angry and I would like hate these plants. And so for me, I realized that like, why do I feel so bad every time I look outside? You know, in my job, I'm like actually getting angry and kind of sick because I've been trained to put a real emotional thing on these living creatures. And it's taken a lot of work to unpack that to where I don't see these, you know, so-called invasives, these introduced species as a scourge. They're just doing their thing. People say they're just living by their original instructions, like we are as well. We're living our life. And it's a lot more healthy, at least for my own system, to see them as just organisms, as things doing their thing, you know?
Mhm. No, I agree. I think it's better for mental health. That's interesting that you say that. I feel some empathy for that, or too, because I've felt the same thing. And I was just like, used to be embarrassed. I was that person on the other end of the email being like, why are you letting the ivy run wild? Yeah, and I couldn't enjoy myself like walking in the woods with, my family or whatever. And they're just like, why are you getting so bent out of shape about this? Like
Yeah.
knotweed or something. And I was like, it doesn't belong. Yeah, and just this purist sort of like I can control everything and this very extreme, like kind of nativist
Mhm.
outlook on things, like not to judge, but or to I'll generalize, but like the native plant society-esque outlook on things that these plants are indigenous and they rightfully belong here. And I'm actually like reversing some effects of colonization by, like improving the habitat.
And it's
Um,
interesting thinking of colonization of like we're reversing, which I think we want to do, reverse the destructive like power of colonization, although we are white settlers ourselves. And by doing that, by removing ivy, but using methods that are really intertwined into the colonial capitalist industrial complex system isn't actually undoing much. And so to actually indigenize or decolonize, whatever the word is, restoration, it's the language, but it's changing our perspective to being more life affirming and deepening our relationship with that place and using methods that are life affirming as well, right? Which of course, when we are removing a plant, just starting acknowledging that we are killing plants and feeling into that a little bit is like a good step. And then also, like, what are some techniques that are more life affirming? One thing that I've been playing around with is, looking at my own cultural heritage. I'm part Swiss, and the scythe. People are scared to see a scythe, the Grim Reaper's tool. But these are now like quite modern tools, and they have different size blades for cutting different things. They're really lightweight, and they're not great for a lot of applications when cutting and trimming plants. But certain things, it's actually quite enjoyable. It takes a while to learn the tool, but we're trying to reduce our carbon footprint. We're trying to deepen our relationship to the land. And the scythe, I've experimented with Ree canary grass, and it cuts that Ree canary grass really nice.
It's interesting. Somebody just mentioned a scythe the other day to me in a DM. That's interesting. I always like giggle. I sort of rolled my eyes. I was like, oh, it's cute. But like, I've never honestly thought about it. Now that you've said it, Toby, too, I'm like, oh, maybe I'm going to do a little research on it. As white settlers and me specifically too, is like coming from like Irish, Slavic background. There's some traumas involved with that. And it goes back to things we've talked about in previous podcast episodes with like feudalism and enclosure of the commons. And there's lots of reasons why our ancestors like escaped or left Europe and came to the US. And there's some privilege to that, but there's a lot of trauma, and we've lost a lot of knowledge along the way. So I don't know a darn bit about my ancestors really, but I've done a little bit of research as well. And I'm just trying to figure out like where they were situated during these certain times. A lot of them were farmers, so like pretty connected to the land, at least in that way, and perhaps had a relationship with some of these plants, but the management of them or the relationship with it has been lost, over the centuries and the travels. So honestly, like you said, the way forward is not to just be the savior or the ally even, but to be like comrades with indigenous folks from here. And like you said, like not just abiding by what Western science, like invasion ecologists say, but reading indigenous scholarship on this issue.
Yep.
If one can just spend like 15 minutes reading an article written by indigenous authors, it will change your mind. So bringing this along back to ivy, where does ivy belong then? And like, how can we live with it?
That was a lot. So I'm first thinking that everybody, if they haven't read Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, you have to read it if you're doing any type of relationship with the lands, because I think her book and Gathering Moss as well are just a great entry into how to build a relationship with the land. And then, yes, I have had the privilege to work with some indigenous folks in Portland, namely Judy Bluehorse Skelton, who is a PSU professor of the Indigenous Nations Studies program. She's amazing. Also, Serena Fasthorse, who's now with Kimimela Consulting. And they, along with other indigenous folks like Greg Archuleta, Savannah Jackson, Sequoia Brecht, they've been a part of a project called Showcake Wetland, where I've been kind of the land steward side of helping or trying to figure out how to co-manage a wetland, a former pumpkin patch. But really the first discussions we were having were like, okay, Toby and other people that work for the agency, like what equity work have you done? What kind of reading? Like, how do we even trust you? Like, do we even move forward with this relationship? I don't know. I've learned a lot from this process. It's been, I think, around 5 years now. And I really, really value indigenous knowledge and all the indigenous knowledge keepers. And it's really helped me reframe my own relationship with the land and what I think restoration is and who it should be for, you know. And I think restoring our own human relationship to the land is part of that. And yes, as white settlers, our family history has gone through a lot of trauma, and we've acted that out partially by removing ourselves from the land and the healing properties of the land. Judy says, heal the land, heal the people. We can heal the land and heal the people at the same time. And the earth itself and the plants and animals, they have so many healing powers that in mainstream society haven't really fully acknowledged. But as restoration practitioners, by reframing what we're doing to the land to, like for this project called ITEC project, Indigenous, Traditional, Ecological, and Cultural Knowledge project, where we're trying to combine my Western perspective with the Indigenous perspective. And I think they can meld really well together, where we can do research, test out plants, and at the same time, take care of the water, take care of the soil. We're not using any herbicides. We're trying lots of different techniques than I ever have. And we're focusing on plants that are useful and aren't on the landscape anymore, whether they're food, medicine, weaving materials used for ceremony. I mean, I think we can accomplish so much, and that's a deeper form of restoration, deeper form of relationship, where we're actually reconnecting with communities. Where I feel like our agency, our colonial project called the City of Portland, has done harm, notably to Indigenous communities, but other communities as well. And part of that healing process has to start with people, So that project has really shown me that healing the land probably begins with people and not just the ivy part. Ivy can be part of that healing process. So yeah.
That's great. I appreciate all that. There is like a distinction. I think you talked about the difference between this, like the iTech project, and the other places where you're just like Oppenheimering the ivy. Like it's a scale thing and a pace thing
Yeah.
too. A lot of us feel some responsibility. There's so much urgency with the threat, the perspective of like these plants or some of the invasives are such a threat. We just need to act fast and big, like over like acres and acres, right? And we're assuming like access to native land. And then when we switch gears, it's like working lower, smaller, something important there.
Yeah. Judy says slow work is deep work. And I feel that way with building human relationships or doing a restoration project. And oftentimes, like, funding promotes that urgency. We only have 2 years, we only have 5 years to restore the area. But really what we need is funding pathways that promote a long-term relationship, where acknowledging the harm done in history and having funding that allows to have the slower, deeper connection to human communities and the plant communities. Because I feel like some of that work where we do it really quickly and then forget about it for 10 years, there's remnants of us doing something on those areas, but it's not that holistic, deeper restoration that I think we all hope for.
Are you familiar with any edible, medicinal, or other uses of ivy, or any other benefits you know about? In like 500 BCE, I think I heard you speak. I think I heard you do a presentation. I remember you referencing a study about how ivy cleans the air. I don't know. Is there any services or benefits you can think about that might help us place some value on it?
Yeah, so ivy does clean the air. There was research in the 80s by NASA where they would put the different plants, mostly indoor plants, into chambers, and they would put a toxic gas in there. And then after 24 hours, they would see if the plants would break it down. And those include formaldehyde and benzene, everything that different chemicals that off gas from spaceships, I guess. And ivy ranked quite high. So for benzene, which is a carcinogen that comes out of our tailpipes, ivy would take out like 96% of the benzene after 24 hours. And it also breaks down formaldehyde, trichloroethylene, and it also will clean the air of particulate matter. There was a study I read about when it grows up buildings, kind of older buildings that will break down from pollution. If it's covered in ivy, it will slow down that degradation process. How does that translate into real terms? I don't know, but it does help clean the air. And what's interesting too is that in the human body, not just the earth body cleaning the air, but the human body, it's, at least in certain places, it's used medicinally to help the lungs, to help breathing. And you can find it at your supermarket in different herbal remedies mixed in with other herbs. And so I found that pretty interesting. And then, yes, ivy being medicinal, cleaning the air, what impact when we cut ivy off trees, especially along roadways, especially along areas that have poor air quality, like the city I live in, how is that impacting the rate of asthma of kids? Looking at the other benefits of ivy, actually cutting it has human impacts. Having it grow has human impacts. And it is a social justice question as well. So I think it's important to continue thinking about that and at least putting that in the conversation of ivy. Do you know of any other medicinal uses?
Yeah, those are the biggest ones, I think, like the phytoremediation, shade, obviously, carbon sequestration. I'm sure, I guess everyone gets a hard on for carbon sequestration a lot of the time.
Cooling.
Medicine, yeah, cooling. It's one of the hardiest lianas in our climates that can grow. And we don't have any surrogate for that except for like poison
Poison
oak,
oak,
maybe.
maybe.
It's
Yeah.
poison oak. And people don't like poison oak either. So it's like one of these things that I do feel like it has some value, and it's like this novel structure that we usually don't have in our like historical Pacific Northwest forests. And I think it's really cool. Of course, when you bring this up, people will refute it once it goes vertical and it's in the sun, then it puts out berries and then it disperses into a place where we may not want it, right? And so it's like mic drops or like walk away from the conversation, which has been hard. And I feel like that's one of the reasons I wanted to really dig into this conversation about it is like, in what circumstances can we live with it? In what circumstances is it balanced out? And where can we like welcome it into our lives? So, too, and I think about those examples, like the best place for it is like right along the freeway. I got this request a few months ago to remove some ivy from some trees along Rainier Avenue in Seattle. In retrospect, I was like, man, that was probably one of the best spots for it because, when it grows up just the trunk, the main stem of like a straight, healthy tree, I don't feel like there's a lot of weight or like threat to it bringing that tree down. But once it gets like really up into like the sun and into the crown,
Yeah.
and it gets really heavy, like thick that, and you can see like the vines down down at human level, those vines can be like the size of your forearm, or even the size of your thighs. Sometimes, I don't know if you've seen those
Yeah.
vines,
My
those woody
arm and
structures
your
like
thigh.
that's, yeah, that's really advanced. Like that's super advanced ivy. And I think that can be problematic. Some people think it can grow like 3 to 6 feet in a year, like climbing, but it takes a long time for it to get to that advanced stage. So now I'm kind of, in some cases, I'm sort of kicking myself for considering like where we are adjacent to roadways where we could leave it. For that
Yeah.
aspect of it. But the question is like maybe not to do, you call like the tree survivor ring, or we call it survival ring
Yeah.
or ring of life.
Yeah. Tree saber.
Tree
Yeah.
saver, yeah, where we like
Yeah.
sever the vines and pretty much everything up above dies. I just thought maybe we could like we don't have to do the whole circumference, cut the whole circumference, but leave some live structure going up maybe, just as a way. It's sort of called a half-assed ivy ring, but I do feel like sometimes there is that wind sail effect or that weight on the tree. But if we just reduce it, because once it's cut, we lose all that whole service, you know?
Yep. It just occurred to me that ivy is a tree hugger. You know, it is the tree hugger. It loves trees so much, you know? And so it's just the other thing that happens is, you know, the tree is growing with the ivy. They're responding to each other, whatever structure they're giving each other. I've counted, I think, over 40 rings on the ivy, you know, so it's old ivy. But you cut that and it has so much wood itself in the ivy, it is partially supporting the tree. Or say you cut the ivy off, then the tree hasn't put in much production into the structure of its own system. And so we've seen where we've cut the really heavy vines off that in some windstorms we'll lose trees that had ivy on them. So yeah, I think there is some balance of like maybe not cutting off all the ivy off that tree, or all the trees are doing it slowly. And yes, purposely letting it, especially on roads. And that ivy only when it's like super heavy does it kill trees. I think it's kind of a misnomer that's been overhyped. I've definitely seen trees heavy with ivy blown over, but I've also gone up in storms and been like, is this true? And drove up into Forest Park after a windstorm and counted all the trees that had fallen down. And most that had fallen down did not have ivy on them. And so I think we blame ivy for a lot of things that aren't actually true. The other thing with ivy that it provides is the birds and other organisms are constantly interfacing with what's around them. And salamanders are found under ivy quite often too. I know we have a rare one in East Portland called the slender salamander that's found under ivy, and also the Pacific giant I found under ivy in Portland. And so it's important to recognize that that's their habitat. Also, because we have invasive worms in a lot of Portland, the duff layer has been basically from historical levels is like disappeared. And so ivy can be this like duff analog where it helps retain moisture in the soil. And my colleague, Dr. Krista von Baron, is starting a study looking at where you remove ivy and where you don't, what does it do to the soil moisture? And so thinking of climate change, it's been so hot. If we take ivy off of the understory, is the soil moisture going to decrease to a level that will drought stress the trees even more? And so I think it's important to think about what the effects of removing ivy are, not just to the wildlife and the tree itself, but the soil moisture could have some pretty big effects. And I know you've noticed some fern die-offs in Seattle. And do you think that had anything to do with the ivy removal that happened in the area? And do you think it could be this soil moisture effect?
I don't know if that's ever been brought up. That's one of the biggest mysteries of our lives, honestly, the sword fern decline. We have no idea. So it's something that's happening pretty much in Seward Park, but we're starting to see it regionally, we think. Definitely Seward Park is almost ground zero, honestly, for like the original Ivy Out sort of weed warrior program in Seattle, like late 90s, perhaps. People have been removing ivy out of there for a number of years. I don't know, but that ground zero spot where we are not, sorry, just trying to use the term ground zero, a couple different ways.
A war metaphor?
Yeah, the epicenter of the sword fern decline was around the hatchery at Seward Park. And that was like a fern gully, like essentially the before and after shots of it were just like dominant sword fern. And then it just, what's left now, almost 10 years later is mostly low Oregon grape, which is kind of just was there as a minority component before. We've since revegetated, but again, it's like kind of a shady forest. The woody species we put in are doing okay. I don't know. I'd have to look at the records of when we cleared ivy out of there, but it had been years prior to when when people first started to observe the sword fern decline. So yeah, I don't know. Maybe. Yeah, I didn't think about the soil moisture. That's incredible. Yeah, so then I guess that begs the question is like, where should we leave it? and like, what's the balance? I was stuff like, it's the fucking question. Where, give me the answer, Toby. Where can
I'm
we
not going to
leave
give you the
it?
answer.
Like, I know, like where, because I've seen it. Like, can it coexist with the sort of with the desirable species mix that we want? Because we always think it like is just gonna grow out of control, and we want to be like, we're done, we're gonna walk away. But I guess the answer is, I think partial answer is I gotta be there. But like, how can we embrace it more?
Yeah, I think we should embrace it more. So I think just taking a deep breath maybe is a first start. I think everything is context dependent as far as what do you treat it? Do you not? How do you treat it? It really isn't spreading. It's not going to kill anybody. All right. It's not an imminent threat. It's not an imminent threat to most trees too. So I think there's definitely some acceptance there. I think thinking of doing a slower approach and being able to take care of a patch and thinking of the patch of land that anyone is stewarding is to take a long-term view of it, take a realistic view of what they want there, just not what they don't want there. And oftentimes ivy can do just fine with trees. And on the sites that I steward, there is ivy on quite a few of them. I usually, if ground ivy, I'm not too concerned about. Sometimes I do hand pull it and remove it if I have a plan on and have species I want to replace that ivy with. And then other areas, I'm just fine with it there. But yeah, I think it's all context dependent and should be driven by community, and what goals are prioritized are going to be different in different places and different people. That's my answer, non-answer.
Yeah, thank you. We'll just, this is one of those ground rules we should have established that we're not going to answer. We're not going to answer anything here. I will tell you, did I tell you? I might have texted you. I did start herb school this last weekend.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Yep. I'm going to herb school. Sarah Butters leads this herb school in Tacoma called Hawthorne and Honey. And so when you talk about that medicinal value in ivy, I promise I'll send you ivy tincture. I'll send you, yeah, maybe a salve. How do I say it? Salve. I don't even, so I'm so ignorant. I got so much to learn. Salve, salve. Maybe a tincture, maybe a decoction. Because I do know it is, it's good for bronchial, like lung health. It's even used not just on humans, but some of the little Google Scholar research I did, I guess it's used in eco-veterinarian practice in the UK. So yeah, it's like really obscure. If you get in deep into Google Scholar, you'll find like a really current research on it.
The ivy might be just here to telling us to like breathe and relax.
Yeah. Any habitat value? I know people will just say it's like a place for rats to live.
Yeah. So rats, that hasn't been confirmed. That's again, not science. I haven't seen a rat study on ivy yet. I can confirm I've seen salamanders under it. It does flower in the winter. So bees like it. And it's usually the only thing flowering. Oftentimes I've seen honeybees, but I've seen other types of bees. So it is a nectar source for pollinators. And then birds do eat it. It may not be the birds that everybody wants, but it does feed birds. And then I've also found a few birds' nests in ivy on the ground and on the sides of trees, with ivy definitely being part of that structure. And then deer, there was this place in Forest Park where the deer would come down and eat this ivy every winter, where it was like the only winter forage for the elk in the edge of Portland, and then come back. And then deer browse it too. Oftentimes I'll see like no leaves. The one thing I think we touched on soil, but I think there's a huge question about mycorrhizae. And underground, many things are connected via the mycelial network. I don't know what that looks like with ivy and the ferns and the plants, but I think it's worth looking into, not just the soil moisture, but also what's happening to the mycelial network when we're removing ivy with various means. Because to me, taking care of the mycelial network is a good goal, but we don't know with that in practice. Besides obvious, don't cut down trees and mess with the soil too much. But by removing ivy, we are messing with the soil. And so, yeah, that's a big question I have. What's it doing to my CEO network?
It's one of these things too. I don't feel like some of these questions about the positive aspects of it, like no one can be funded to research the positive attributes of ivy in the Pacific Northwest. Like maybe back in its like native range, but I don't feel like it's just be a career burner for somebody. That's one of those conspiracy. Like I do think that's a little conspiracy theory, but I don't think people are colluding about it. But it's like is not fundable. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry. All right.
Yeah. Well, it was
Cool,
great
man.
chatting with you.
Yeah, good talking with you. That was a long, meandering conversation.
Yeah. Thank you for podcast and thanks for the conversation.
Talk to you soon.
All right.
See ya. Thanks for joining me again for another episode of Treehugger Podcast. I'm Michael Yadrick. I would love to hear what you think about this topic. Let me know. The archive of this episode lives online at treehuggerpod.com. The podcast is on social media at treehuggerpod or ping me at Gmail. It takes a community to keep the podcast going. I'm totally independent and you can donate to help cover the small overhead costs of the show. Check out the show notes for mobile payment services to PayPal, Venmo, and Cash App. You can also subscribe, rate, and review the show on whichever podcast platform you listen to. It really helps people find the show. Or tell a friend about the show. Thanks for hanging out. See you in Ivyland.